Hello, my name is Sebastian Spitz. I'm a graduate of Harvard Law School and a PhD student in sociology at Harvard University. Welcome to Sociology of the Present. On this video show, I'll be discussing social science research and how it helps us to understand current events. Right now, I'd like to spend time understanding why Trump won the 2024 election. There's a lot of literature understanding the trajectory of American politics over the past 2 decades, and I think it has a lot to tell us. And depending on the success of the show, I may move on to other topics too, as they arise. Social scientists have learned so much about the world around us, but we don't always succeed in communicating the results of our research to the public. That's what I'll try to do on Sociology of the Present. As a social scientist, I'm guided by the data, but I may editorialize and say what I think ought to happen. When I do, I'll let you know. As social scientists, we try to separate normative questions, that is, questions about what is good or bad, what should or should not happen, and scientific questions, where we try to describe and explain the world. I'll be focused on the latter here, but I may share my views on the former. I expect to release a video of about 10 minutes, about once a week. Since I'm just starting out, I'm not entirely sure, and that's subject to change. And with that, let's get started with episode 1, the Trump coalition. Were young men to blame? So who voted for Donald Trump in 2024? The American people did. More specifically, as of November 16th, about 76 million people voted for Donald Trump and about 74 million people voted for Kamala Harris. That means Trump got 50.1% of the popular vote as of today. Now, a few states have a few more votes to count, especially California. Trump won by a little less than 2 percentage points, and that margin may fall a little as California continues to count. So it was a gap of about 1.8%, and that is really not a landslide. We can turn now to understanding those results a little bit more. So this graph shows the margin of victory of the winner in each presidential election going back to 1976. These data are from Wikipedia, other than for 2024, which is from the New York Times. The y-axis shows how much the winner of the election won the popular vote by. So, for instance, in 2024, you can see that's the one on the rightmost data point, and it's at a little less than 2%. You can see how it's changed over time. And you can see that there are some real landslide elections: 1980, 1984, 1988, 1996, 2008, all come to mind. 1984, you can see it was wild. That was Reagan's election, and re-election, and he won by something like 17, 18 percentage points. And conversely, 2 percentage points, as you can see in this graph, is just not all that much historically. Trump won the popular vote this year by less than Hillary Clinton did in 2016 or George W. Bush in 2004. And neither Hillary Clinton nor Bush in 2004 won a popular vote landslide. Those were both close elections. Now, 2 of the data points are below 0 because the winner of the election failed to win the popular vote. The winner failed to win the popular vote. That was, of course, George Bush in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016. Now, of course, the American election is not decided by the popular vote, but by the Electoral College. Trump won 312 electoral votes, having needed 270 to win. This is slightly more than Trump won in 2016 when he won 304, or Biden in 2020 when he won 306, although, frankly, 312 is pretty close to both of those. Kamala Harris was close to winning 3 swing states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, the so-called blue wall. Had she won these 3 states, she would have won the election. She lost each of them by less than 2 percentage points. So again, this was a close election, not down to the very wire, not 2000, not even 2020 or 2016, but it's still a close election. It was a decisive win for Trump, but not a landslide. Turnout declined slightly from 2020. Fewer Americans voted, but the decline is pretty small. Here's a graph I directly took from the Washington Post, and I encourage you to check out the whole article. I'll put a link in the show notes. Again, not all the votes have been counted. So the Post is estimating exactly how many votes will have been cast, and this is from a few days after the election, so it might change a little bit, but not by very much. This graph looks at the number of votes relative to the size of the population that can vote based on age and citizenship status. So we can see that turnout went down slightly from 2020 to 2024, from 65.5% to 64.5%. But we have to keep in mind that 2020 had record turnout. And so turnout in 2024 is actually well above the norm in recent elections. In fact, a turnout of 64.5% would be higher than the turnout in every other election from 1908 to the present, other than 1908 and 2020. And 2020, of course, was a unique election happening in the middle of the pandemic and with many more options to vote early and or by mail. So given the uniqueness of the 2020 election, 2024's turnout numbers look pretty high. And I think we can infer from this that if your explanation of the election is, well, turnout numbers were lower, and that's why Harris lost, this really challenges that because the turnout decline was very, very small. So with that, let's look at the exit polls and see who voted for Trump and Harris. Exit polls are our best estimate of who voted for each candidate. They aren't perfect, but they are one important source. I'm going to use the exit poll as reported by CNN and the New York Times rather than AP's VoteCast, which is kind of an exit poll. It's pretty similar. I'm also looking at exit polls as opposed to county level data or precinct level data. Both of those are also important sources of information. I'm, again, just relying on the exit polls kind of simplistically. Other, analyses that'll be done in the future, not by me, but by, other analysts can triangulate between sources. What is the exit polls? What do the exit polls say? What does the precinct level data say? What does AP VoteCast say? And try and get a more comprehensive picture. That's what we do as social scientists. We take into consideration different sources and see where they're consistent, where they differ. In this case, I'm just using one source just to kind of give a simplifying narrative that we can make sense of. Now, with respect to exit polls, it raises the question of how should we use them? One way is to think about what group went for which candidate. Did candidate A win this group by 60 percentage points, or did candidate B win them by a little bit? So who's winning each group? The other way that we can think about it is what groups went for each candidate relative to the previous election. If we're trying to understand change over time, that is, in this case, why Democrats won in 2020, but Republicans won in 2024, then it can be really useful to think about which groups are moving towards a particular candidate. Certain groups are historically more likely to vote for certain parties. If they've moved to be less supportive of that party, that's an important switch, even if they still are voting for that party overall. But if they're doing so in lesser numbers, that is really important to understand. We can also think about, and this won't be the focus in this episode, but of the support for candidate X, how many are in a particular group? So something like, you might say 85% of Trump supporters are white, or something like that. That's the other way. We're not going to be looking at that in this episode. Now, another thing we should talk about is in terms of groups, because that's what the exit polls do. You're talking about men, you're talking about women, you're talking about low income, high income, college educated, white, black, Hispanic, gay, straight, Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, you name it. You can split up everyone into groups, white suburban women. And when we do that, it can be valuable, but it also has a downside, which is that we're assuming that those groups are socially meaningful and constant over time. That is, if I tell you that 30% of voters in Group A voted for the Democrat in election 1 and 40% voted for the Democrat in election 2, we infer that the same group of voters were in Group A in both elections, that some of them didn't support the Democrat in election 1, but did in election 2. and that this has something to do with being in this group A. But in theory, none of these assumptions might hold. People might change groups over time. Now, we know this happens with age. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. Young voters in 2012, Obama's base of young voters, are middle-aged voters today. It can also happen with income and even with gender and race insofar as identification changes. Elections are about who votes, but it's possible the composition of voters within the group changed. Maybe people who opposed the Democrat in election 1 stayed home in election 2. And maybe there was a real shift, but it has nothing to do per se with being in the group. Now, let me give you a very silly example of the latter. I'd bet a lot of money that New York Yankees fans swung more towards Trump in this election relative to 2020 than did Atlanta Braves fans. Now, does this have anything to do with baseball? I'm a big baseball fan, I'm a Yankees fan. Or were we disappointed at the election, at the World Series results, and that made us angry at the status quo, and so we voted for Trump? No, it has nothing to do with baseball. The reason I say that Yankees fans swung more towards Trump is that the New York metro area swung a lot more towards Trump than the Atlanta metro area. And I infer that baseball fans in the metro areas are acting like everyone else. So if the exit polls had asked people's favorite baseball teams, we could show that the Yankees fans are swinging towards the Republicans, and then we could analyze as if Harris was really struggling with Yankees fans, or why Trump didn't have enough support among the Braves fans. And, of course, this would be absurd. The election results have nothing to do with baseball. Now, this can happen with actual, realistic demographic groups that you might be teasing apart. You can see a swing in a particular group, but that swing might have nothing to do with that group per se, but it might have to do with something else that people in that group tend to have in common. Maybe, for example, there's a group of people who have relatively low levels of education, and people with low levels of education have swung towards the Republicans, let's say. So you might see, oh, people in this group are swinging towards the Republicans, but it might not be that being in that group has to do with them swinging towards the Republicans. It might just be that they have low levels of education, for example. So splitting up the electorate in these groups can be really simplifying. It can tell you something useful, but it can also be misleading if you're not careful. Now, one other point about this type of group analysis that I think is really important is to make clear that elections are not a morality contest between different groups. Results like these are often weaponized to make it seem like groups that vote against your preferred candidate are bad, or that they should be blamed for the results. Or conversely, the groups who support your candidates are the good guys. If I say Group X's movement since 2020 is the reason why Trump won, and we don't like Trump, then it might seem as if I don't like Group X. But this is really a bad way of looking at this. Vote choices are incredibly complicated, and there are many reasons why people in any particular group vote a particular way. Also, I don't think we should be hating people based on their political preferences, but that's a normative value that I have. There's no finger pointing going on here, and I think it's really important to be able to look at these data objectively without turning this into a match where people defend the moral purity of particular groups. I think that's a really bad way. It's going to hinder us from wanting to even do this analysis when it's really important that we look at, understand who's voting for the Democrats and who's voting for the Republicans. So with that, let's start with gender. So Harris won women 53% to 45%, and Donald Trump won men 55% to 42%. And we can do that with all sorts of groups. I'll tell you in the next episode about how Harris won blacks, Latinos, and Asians, whereas Trump won whites and racial others. I'll tell you in a bit about how Harris won younger voters and Trump won middle-aged voters, and how the elderly were split. But overall, those tallies aren't as helpful in understanding election results. What we really want to do is understand who's changing over time, who's moving towards Trump, who's moving towards Harris. So what this graph does is it shows you the advantage for the Republican candidate among men and women dating back to 2012. I picked 2012 relatively arbitrarily, but just to give you a sense of kind of the Obama coalition in his second election, and then how Trump has transformed the party coalitions since, in each of his 3 elections. So I'm using the GOP advantage in this case means the gap between the Republican and Democratic candidate. Since Trump won men 55 to 42%, as I said, the GOP advantage for men this year is 13%. So that the blue data point on top on the right in 2024 is at 13% because that was Trump's advantage. Now you can put advantage in quotes for women, but I'm just using that term so as to not create a double negative. The Republicans lost among women, so the advantage is negative. That is to say, it's actually a Democratic advantage. And one thing you can see is that look at 2020 and look at 2024. And you can see that for the blue line, you can see from 2020 to 2024 that Trump gained support among men. But you can also see that actually he gained support among women as well. And in fact, Trump gained more among women than he did among men, meaning that the gender gap shrunk. So you didn't, I think that a lot of media is saying, oh, there's such a big divide between men and women. Actually, the gender gap is shrinking, or at least it did in this election. Contrast that with 2012 to 2016, where you can see men moved more towards Trump in 2016 relative to 2012, and women moved more towards the Democrat, more towards Clinton than to Obama. So there, the gender gap was increasing. And this time around, that wasn't the case. The gender gap shrunk a little bit from 2020 to 2024. Now, some in the media have singled out young men in particular as being an important group that swung towards Trump in this election. That's why I've actually titled the episode based on that, because it seems to be a really big narrative. He raises questions: have young men been radicalized on the internet by people like Andrew Tate? Are the challenges that young men face causing them to embrace Hulk Hogan style masculinity? And I want to be very clear. The answer to that is, it seems to be no, because there's no evidence of a major gender gap among young voters. This is a media narrative that is not supported by the fair look at the evidence. Now, you can see here, and I think this is important, that the 0% line is very high. Since 2012, young men and young women have been Democratic, but there's been a big gender gap overall. Young women have been much more Democratic than young men. And you can see that, that has been pretty consistent, 2012, 2016, 2020. And then 2020 to 2024, you can see that there was a big increase in support for Trump among young men. That's true. Young men actually slightly went for Trump as per this exit poll, but not by very much. However, you can also see that young women moved towards Trump as well. For the young men, the shift was 13 percentage points, and for young women, it was 11 percentage points. And that's just not a very big difference at all. 2 percentage points. With these types of polls, you have not an infinite sample size, so it might not even be statistically significant. 2 percentage points, it would not make very much of it at all. In other words, Democrats had a problem with young people in this election. And they lost ground among young men and young women. They lost ground at about the same rate. This is a case where just looking at the single point in time would say, oh my gosh, Democrats lost young men. But they've always had this gender gap between young men and young women, and that gap stayed pretty constant. What you saw was just a shift from the young among young people overall. So that's what we should be thinking about when we're thinking about young people in this election. We should be thinking about it as a men and women story, not just a young men story. And whatever analyses we have, whatever explanation we have, it should not just focus on young men. We need to be able to explain why young men and young women moved towards Trump in this election. And just overall, there are important age dynamics in this race, but the gender by age dynamics are not super interesting. Men and women of each age group moved pretty similarly. And I'll show you that with the other groups. So this is ages 30 to 44. You can see throughout this period, men in this group have been slightly Republican, and young women have been slightly Democratic. In this election, Trump gained among both men and women. This was the best Republican performance for men and women in this age bracket over the period. Now, Trump did gain slightly more among the men than the women in the ages 30 to 44. He gained by 9 points among men and 3 points among women. So if there is an age gap, that age group of men where Democrats should be worrying, it's millennials, roughly, and I'm not sure how helpful that term is, but ages 30 to 44. So it's more kind of millennial age people, not so much the Gen Z. Now, conversely, for ages 45 to 64, firstly, again, we see that Trump has gained for both men and women for ages 45 to 64. But Trump here actually had the biggest gains among women, not among men. You can see that the swing among women is quite large. It's from something like 13 percentage point Democratic advantage to, let's say, a 1 or 2 percentage point Republican advantage. That's a big shift among women, among these middle-aged women towards Trump. Men, he did gain, but by less. And this is the first time, by the way, that Trump, 2016, 2020, 2024, this is the first time that Trump won the women age 45 to 64. And lastly, we have the seniors. And we can see that Harris had one bright spot age-wise, which is the older voters. All the other age groups Trump gained relative to 2020. The seniors were the only group where Harris gained. And she gained among both men and women. So in summing up this age times gender story, I think we really ought to focus on the age side. Democrats have almost completely neutralized Republicans' advantage with seniors. However, everyone else, including Obama-era Democrats' base of young voters, have moved to the Republicans. And insofar as there's any age group with interesting gender dynamics, it's the growth in support for Trump among women aged 45 to 64 and men aged 30 to 44. And as we think about these overall results that I've showed you, what have we learned? What do we take away? Well, a lot of the media narratives about the election results are focusing on male voters. But even just looking at recent history, we can see that these narratives are misplaced. Men and women mostly moved in similar directions. And I think what I've shown you here is important. If you're a Democrat trying to win back voters and you think you have a specific problem with young men specifically, you might adopt different strategies than if you realize that you've lost ground with both young men and young women. And if you're trying to understand the extent to which gender bias affected the election results, knowing that women moved as much towards Trump as did men is an important place to start. So that's all I have for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to be turning to race and class dynamics in this election, also race times genders. We're looking at white men, black women, etc. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe, share with your friends, and I'll see you in the next episode.